Garrett Hale ripped the closet door clean off its latch and dropped to his knees beside the woman crumpled in the dark wrists. Bound lips cracked the front of her dress, soaked dark red. He'd ridden into town for one thing, only a new rifle. Instead, he'd found something the whole street had been hiding behind a smile. "Who did this to you, ma'am?" he breathed. She only flinched, more scared of being found than of dying. If this story stirs something in you, subscribe and stay with me to the very end, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story has traveled tonight. The morning Garrett Hale rode into Sage Bend, he was thinking about nothing heavier than a rifle. His old Winchester had cracked along the stock the week before, and a man who ran cattle on the high ridges didn't go long without a good gun. So he'd left the ranch before sunup, the heat already pressing down like a hand on the back of his neck, and he'd told his foreman he'd be back by supper. Howe was 39 years old, a tall man with gray starting at his temples, and a silence about him that most folks mistook for coldness. He had money more than anyone in Sage Bend, truth be told, but he didn't wear it. He wore the same dust as every other man on the street, and he tipped his hat to the women the same as he had when he'd been poor. He hitched his horse outside Pruitt's Mercantile and stepped up onto the boardwalk. "Mr. Hale." A man passing by touched his brim. "Hot enough for you?" "Reckon it'll do," Garrett said. That was the kind of morning it was. Easy. Ordinary. Inside the store it was cooler, dim, the air thick with the smell of leather and coffee and gun oil. Behind the counter stood Elias Pruitt, a soft pink man with quick eyes who'd never once in 20 years met Garrett's gaze square. "Mornin', Mr. Hale," Pruitt said, and his voice came out a half step too high. What is it you're needin'?" "Rifle," Garrett said. "Mine split. Need a good one. Maybe 2 boxes of shells." Course. Pruitt wiped his palms on his apron. "Got a fine Winchester come in last month? Let me just—" He glanced toward the back of the store. Once. Quick. Then away. "Let me get it down for you." Garrett didn't think anything of the glance. Not then. He'd remember it later, though. He'd remember it for the rest of his life. Pruitt brought the rifle to the counter and set it down, and his hands weren't steady. Garrett picked it up, sighted along the barrel, worked the lever. A good gun. Clean action. "This'll do," he said. "What do I owe you?" $32 with the shells." Garrett reached for his money, and that was when he heard it. A sound. Small. From the back of the store, behind the rows of saddles, and the stacked feed sacks, and the door that led to the gear closet, where Pruitt kept his harness and his spare tack. A sound like a person trying not to make one. Garrett went still. "That'll be 32 even," Pruitt said again, louder now, sliding the shells across the counter, talking fast. "And if you're headed back up the mountain, you'll want to mind the south trail. They say there's been—" "Hush," Garrett said. Pruitt hushed. The sound came again. A whimper. Muffled. The sound of somebody with their mouth bound, trying to call out anyway. Garrett set the rifle down on the counter. Slow. He looked at Pruitt, and Pruitt's pink face had gone the color of curdled milk. "What's in your closet, Elias?" "Nothin'. Old harness is all. Rats, maybe. We been havin' rats." Garrett was already walking. Mr. Hale, you can't go back there. That's private property. You got no right." Garrett reached the closet door. It was latched from the outside. A man didn't latch a door from the outside to keep rats in. He flipped the latch. The door was stuck or held, and he didn't wait to find out which. He set his shoulder to it and tore it off the latch entire, and the daylight from the high window fell across what was inside. A woman. She was wedged into the corner among the coils of rope and the bridles, her knees drawn up, her wrists lashed in front of her, and a strip of cloth knotted across her mouth. Her dress had been pale once. Now the whole front of it was dark and stiff, and her hair was matted to her cheek and her eyes. Her eyes were the worst of it, because when the light hit her, she didn't look relieved. She looked terrified. She shrank back against the rope as if Garrett were the one come to finish her. Garrett dropped to his knees. "Easy," he said. "Easy now, ma'am. I ain't gonna hurt you." She shook her head hard, frantic, her bound hands coming up. "I'm gonna take this off your mouth, that's all, just that." He moved his fingers slow so she could see them, and he worked the wet knot loose at the back of her head and drew the cloth away. She gasped, coughed, and the first words out of her weren't a thank you, weren't a plea. "Don't," she rasped. "Don't take me to town. Don't give me back to them. The sheriff signed the papers." "What papers?" "He'll say I'm a thief. He'll say it, and they'll believe him because he's the law, and I'm nobody, and you—" Her voice broke. "You look like a man with land. You'll do what they tell you. You'll hand me over and go home to your supper." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Behind him in the doorway of the closet, Elias Pruitt had appeared, twisting his apron in both hands, and his voice came out in a wheedling whine. "Now, Mr. Hale, I can explain. I surely can. That woman's a runaway, and a thief. She stole from the land company. They brought her here last night for safekeeping till the marshal could safekeeping." Garrett didn't turn around. "You tied a woman up in your closet and split her open, and you call it safekeeping. I never split nobody. She came that way. I swear on my life, she came that way. All I done was hold her like they asked." "Who asked?" Pruitt's mouth opened and shut. "Who asked Elias?" "Voss," the woman whispered. "Harlan Voss, the Dominion Land Company. They've got the sheriff. They've got half this town." She was shaking now, and Garrett could see what it cost her to keep talking through it. "I worked for them. I kept their books, and I found out what they were doing, and I took the ledger, and I ran." Garrett reached out and, gentle as he could with a knife that big, cut the rope from her wrists. The marks underneath were raw and ugly. He'd seen a lot of things in 39 years. He'd buried his mother, and he'd watched corrupt men take his family's first land and sign it away with a smile. And he'd thought somewhere along the years that he'd gone hard enough that not much could reach him anymore. Looking at those wrists, something in his chest reached anyway. "Can you stand?" he asked. "I don't know." "Then I'll carry you. But I'm getting you out of this closet, ma'am, that much I can promise you right now." For the first time, something flickered across her face that wasn't fear. It wasn't trust yet. She was too smart and too hurt for trust. But it was the start of something. "Lydia," she said. "My name's Lydia. Lydia Cross. I'm not a thief." "I never reckoned you were," Garrett said. "A thief don't bleed in a closet. A thief gets paid." He got an arm under her and brought her up, and she swayed against him light as a fence rail, and he understood she hadn't eaten or had water in a good while. That was when the bell over the front door jangled. Boots came across the floorboards. Spurs. 3 pairs by the sound, and Garrett knew before he turned around that the easy morning was over and wasn't ever coming back. He set Lydia against the wall square on her feet, and he stepped in front of her. The men who'd come in wore the kind of clothes town men wore when they wanted you to think they were better than you. The one in front had a tin star pinned to his vest. Sheriff Del Cobb. Behind him stood 2 others. Garrett didn't know. Hard men, hired men, both with their hands resting easy near their guns. "Pruitt," the sheriff said, not looking at Garrett yet. "You said you'd keep her quiet. I tried, Sheriff, God's truth. I tried, but Mr. Hale, he come in for a rifle and he heard her and I couldn't." "Shut up, Elias." Sheriff Cobb turned his eyes on Garrett at last, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he holds all the cards and knows it. "Garrett, didn't expect to see you in this mess. This here's a legal matter. That woman behind you is a fugitive. Stole valuable property from the Dominion Land Company and assaulted a man in the doing of it. We've been hunting her 2 days. 2 days, Garrett said. And you kept her tied up in a closet for 2 days. We kept her secure. You kept her bleedin'." The sheriff's smile thinned. "She resisted. She weighs about as much as my saddle." Garrett's voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was the thing about Garrett Hale that men learned too late. The calmer he got, the closer he was to the edge. 3 of you and a man with a closet, and she resisted. "Step aside, Garrett. This ain't your fight. You got a good spread up the mountain. You got cattle, you got money, you got everything a man could want. Don't throw it in the dirt over some runaway clerk girl who'll hang anyway." Behind him, Garrett heard Lydia's breath catch. He heard her shift her weight, ready to bolt, knowing there was nowhere to bolt to. And Garrett thought about his father's land. The first land, the good land down in the valley, the land they'd taken with papers and signatures and the smile of an honest-looking man, while the whole town watched and said nothing because it wasn't their fight. He'd been a boy then. He'd watched grown men look at their boots while everything his family had was signed away by liars. He'd promised himself that day that he'd never be one of the men who looked at his boots. What did she steal exactly? Garrett asked. Company property. What property? That's company business. A book, Garrett said. She stole a book with the truth in it. He didn't know it for certain, but he watched the sheriff's face when he said it, and the sheriff's face told him everything. How about this, Sheriff? How about you wait right here nice and patient while I read what she stole? Then if she's a thief, I'll hand her over myself. The room went very still. You don't want to do that, the sheriff said softly. No, Garrett agreed. I don't reckon I do, but I'm gonna. He let his coat fall open just enough that the three of them could see he was wearing his own gun, and that his hand was near it, and that he was a man who'd grown up on a mountain where you didn't draw unless you meant to use it. Now, where's her satchel? Nobody answered. The leather satchel she was carrying when your men ran her down. Where is it? Burned it, one of the hired men said, a thick-necked fellow with a scar through his eyebrow. Burned the whole thing last night. And Garrett watched Lydia's face crumple just for a heartbeat before she caught herself. They'd burned it. They'd burned the proof. But then she lifted her chin, and she said something that changed the shape of the whole room. Then you burned paper, Lydia said. Her voice was hoarse and cracked, but it carried. You burned copies. The ledger I kept, Harlan Voss's ledger. The real one is where you'll never find it. And every name's in my head besides. Every forged signature. Every widow you robbed. Every ranch you marked. She took one step forward, out from behind Garrett, swaying but upright. Including yours, Mr. Hale. Garrett looked at her. They marked your ranch, she said to him. Your south pasture. There's a lien in that ledger says you owe the Dominion Land Company $1,100 on a note you never signed. They were going to come for you next month. The hired men shifted, and Garrett understood then that this had stopped being about a stranger in a closet. That's so, he said quietly. That's so. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his pistol. She's lying, Garrett. She's a clever little liar, and she's reaching for any rope she can. My south pasture, Garrett said, borders the old Crane place. Widow Crane. Lost it this spring. Folks said she defaulted. He'd never thought twice about it. A widow, a default, the way of things. He'd looked at his boots, hadn't he? Same as the rest. She default, Sheriff, or'd you forge her name same as you forged mine. You're making a mistake. Likely, Garrett said. Made a few in my life. This won't be the worst of 'em. He reached back without looking and found Lydia's arm, steadying her. Here's how it's gonna go. I'm taking Miss Cross out that door. I'm putting her on my horse, and I'm taking her up the mountain to my ranch, where there's a bed and water and a woman to tend her. My cook Hattie, she's tended worse. And you three are gonna stand right where you are and let us walk. And if we don't, the scar-browed man said, then you'll find out why I came to town for a rifle in the first place, Garrett said. Because I'm a man who likes to have one. And I'm a fair shot. And there's three of you standing close together in a small room, and only one of me, and I like those odds better than you do. A long silence. The kind that has a sound to it. The sheriff was doing the arithmetic. Garrett could see it behind his eyes. A killing in Pruitt's store in daylight with the storekeeper as a witness. That was a different thing than a runaway clerk dying quiet in the dark. That brought marshals. That brought questions. And the sheriff had a great deal he didn't want questioned. This ain't finished, Cobb said at last. No, Garrett agreed. I don't expect it is. He drew Lydia toward the door, keeping himself between her and the three men the whole way, and not one of them moved. Pruitt pressed himself against the shelves and wouldn't meet anybody's eye. At the door, Lydia stopped. She turned and looked back at the storekeeper, the soft pink man who'd held her 2 days in his closet and brought her water just often enough to keep her alive for the marshal. You knew, she said to him. Every time you walked past that door you knew. Pruitt's mouth worked. Weren't my business, miss. A man's got to live in this town. So have I, Lydia said. So've I. And she let Garrett lead her out into the white summer light. He lifted her onto his horse like she weighed nothing, and he could feel how she trembled, and he could feel too the moment she made herself stop trembling by sheer force of will, because she'd decided trembling was a thing she couldn't afford. He'd known strong men who couldn't do that. He found he admired it more than he'd admired most anything in years. He swung up behind her and turned the horse toward the mountain trail. Half the town watched them go. They stood in their doorways and on the boardwalks, the blacksmith, the dressmaker, the men from the saloon, and not one of them said a word. They watched a bleeding woman ride out of Sage Bend in the arms of the richest man in the county, and they looked at their boots and they said nothing because it wasn't their fight. Garrett looked back at them once. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself this very morning riding in. The look of a man who keeps his head down so trouble passes over. He was done with it. "You're shaking," Lydia said low, surprised. "Mr. Hale, you're the one shaking now." "Reckon I am," he said. "Why?" He was quiet a while, the horse climbing the town, falling away behind them into heat haze. "Because I just figured out something," he said finally. "Spent 20 years telling myself I was a careful man, a smart man, mind my own, keep my land, keep my cattle, keep my mouth shut. And I thought that made me different from the men who took my daddy's place." He shook his head slow. "Wasn't different. Was just the same men waiting my turn to be robbed. And I'd have handed you back this morning if I hadn't heard you through that door." "You didn't hand me back." "No." "Why not?" Garrett looked down at the woman in front of him, at the raw marks on her wrists where she'd been bound, at the ledger of names she carried not on paper, but in her own stubborn head at the chin she kept lifting, no matter how many times the world tried to push it down. "Because some things," he said, "a man only gets to walk past once before he ain't a man anymore, and I'd walked past about one too many." Lydia didn't answer that. But after a moment, just slightly, she let herself lean back against him, and she let him take some of her weight, and for the first time since the men of the Dominion Land Company had run her down in the dark, 2 days before Lydia Cross closed her eyes and did not fight to stay awake. The mountain rose ahead of them, green and cool and waiting, and Garrett Hale rode toward it with the truth, riding in front of him and behind him a whole town that had chosen one more time to look at its boots. He didn't look back again. The ranch sat quiet under the noon sun when Garrett rode in and Hattie was on the porch before the horse had stopped, her hands already drying on her apron, her eyes already going hard at the sight of the blood. "Lord have mercy," she breathed. "Garrett Hale, what have you brought up my mountain?" "Trouble," Garrett said, easing Lydia down into his arms. "Set the spare room, hot water, and don't ask her nothing yet." "I'll ask what I please." "Hattie." He didn't raise his voice. He never did. "Not yet." The old woman pressed her lips flat and stepped aside, and that was the last argument anyone won with Garrett Hale that day. Lydia woke near dark. She came up out of the bed, fast fists swinging at the shape leaning over her, and Hattie caught both wrists in 2 strong brown hands and held them like a woman holding a frightened calf. "Easy, easy now, girl. You're safe." "Nobody's safe," Lydia gasped. "Where am I? Where's the man, the one with the gun?" "Down the hall, and he had no more hurt you than fly." Hattie eased her back against the pillow. "You've been out the better part of a day. I cleaned that gash in your side and stitched it best I could, and it's a wonder you didn't bleed to death in that wagon. Now, you're going to drink this broth, and you're going to do it slow or it comes right back up." Lydia looked at the bowl. She looked at the door. She looked at her own bandaged wrists. "Why?" she said. "Why's he doing this? You'll have to ask him." Hattie pressed the spoon into her hand. "But I've cooked for that man 11 years, and I've watched him turn away every woman in 3 counties tried to soften him, and I've never once seen him carry a stranger up this mountain. So whatever you've got, girl, you've got something he wants kept alive." Lydia drank the broth. She watched the door the whole time. When Garrett came in, she had her back to the headboard and the bowl held in both hands like she might throw it. "You're awake," he said, and stopped a careful distance away. "Good. You eat?" "Why am I here?" "Because the alternative was a closet." "That's not an answer." Garrett pulled the chair from the wall, turned it backward, and sat with his arms folded over the top of it. "All right. Here's an answer. You said something in that store. Said the Dominion Land Company forged a note on my south pasture. $1,100 I never borrowed. You said it like you'd seen it written. So I want to know if you were lying. I don't lie. Everybody lies. Questions whether you were lying about that. Lydia set the bowl down on the quilt. When she spoke, her voice came out flat and exhausted, the voice of someone who'd told the truth so many times to so many people who didn't want to hear it, that the truth had stopped feeling like anything at all. 2 years I kept the books for Harlan Voss, she said. Started honest. He hired me because I was quick with figures, and I was a woman, and a woman wouldn't ask questions. For a year I didn't. Then I started noticing things. A ranch that defaulted on a loan it never took. A widow's signature on a mortgage 3 weeks after her husband signed it, except her husband had been dead 2 months by then, and dead men don't co-sign. Garrett's jaw tightened. He said nothing. I told myself I was wrong, told myself a long time. Then one night Voss had me copy a clean ledger from a marked one. A second set of books. The marked one had the true accounts. The clean one had the lies he showed the courts. She looked at her hands. Your name was in the marked book, Mr. Hale. Hale G. South Pasture 1100. Due for seizure August next. I copied it with my own hand. The room went quiet. Describe it, Garrett said. The lien. The whole page. The book. Everything. If you saw it, you can tell me what it looked like. So she did. She told him the ledger was bound in oxblood leather, with a cracked spine, that Voss kept it in the bottom drawer of his desk under a false board, that the marked entries were written in a green ink. He ordered special from Denver, because he liked that nobody else in the territory used it. She told him the column headings the way the dates ran the initials of the clerk before her, who'd disappeared one winter and never come back. And Garrett, who had been cheated once before, and had spent 20 years making certain he'd never be cheated again, sat very still and felt the floor shift under him. Green ink, he said. From Denver. Why? Because 3 months back, a man came to my door with a paper. Asked me to sign acknowledgement of a property survey. Friendly fella. Said it was routine. I near signed it. Garrett's voice had gone low and strange. I didn't, because I make it a rule never to sign what I haven't read twice. But I remember the paper, Miss Cross. I remember thinking it was a peculiar color of ink for a government form. He looked up at her. Green. Lydia's breath left her slow. You believe me, she said. It wasn't a question. It was wonder. I believe the ink, Garrett said. Belief in you'll come, or it won't. But the ink I believe. It should have been a small thing. It wasn't. Something in Lydia's face broke open, not into tears, she was past tears, but into something rawer, the look of a person who has been calling for help down a well for 2 years, and finally faintly heard an echo come back. There's a ledger, she said. The real one, the oxblood one. I didn't burn it, and they didn't either. I hid it before they caught me. It's the only thing in the world that proves any of this. And if Voss finds it, every family they've robbed stays robbed, and every name in it is just gossip from a runaway clerk. Where? She hesitated. Miss Cross. They tied you in a closet. I cut you loose. If I meant to sell you back, I'd have done it cheaper than this. In the wall of the church, she said finally. St. Anne's in Sage Bend. Behind the loose stone where the choir robes hang. Nobody'd think to look in a church. A bitter little sound came out of her. Voss owns the sheriff and the assessor and half the council, but he doesn't own God yet. Garrett almost smiled. Almost. Then we leave it where it is, he said, till we know how to use it. A weapon you can't aim is just a weapon for the other man. He stood. Rest. We'll talk in the morning. Mr. Hale. He stopped at the door. Why does a rich man care, she said, about widows, about forged notes on land he could buy 10 times over? For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he said, because I wasn't always rich, and the men who made me poor smiled the whole time they did it. Get some sleep. He left before she could ask anything else. The next morning, he found her in the kitchen, dressed in a clean shirt of Hattie's, going through the few papers she'd had folded inside her bodice the whole time, the ones she hadn't dared let out of her own body, and she had them spread on the table and sorted into piles before he'd finished his coffee. I can't sit in a bed, she said, not looking up. I'll lose my mind. Give me work or I'll find some. You're stitched. I'm not dead. She tapped one pile. These are the families I'm sure of. The ones I copied with my own hand. Crane. Ostrander. The Mexican family south of the River Reyes. A man named Delph. And 6 more I can name from memory. She finally looked at him. Some of them are still on their land, Mr. Hale. They don't know yet. The notes come due in waves, so the town never sees it happen all at once. If we warn them, Voss knows we're comin'. If we don't warn them, they sign things. They make deals to save themselves, and they make it worse. She held his eyes. I kept the books. I know how he does it. He picks them off one at a time in the dark where nobody can see, because a thing nobody sees isn't real. The only way to beat him is to make people look. Garrett set down his coffee. I thought about the men in the doorways of Sage Bend, staring at their boots, while a bleeding woman rode out of town. He thought about himself as a boy watching grown men do the same. Then we'll make 'em look, he said. Quiet first. We ride out to your families. We hear it from their own mouths, so it ain't just your word and mine. We build it slow, and we build it solid. You up to ridin'? I've never been on a horse in my life. Then that's the first thing I teach you, Garrett said. Because a woman who can't ride out, can't ride away. And on this mountain, Miss Cross, you'll want to know how to do both. They started that afternoon. She was terrible at it. She gripped the reins like a woman strangling a snake, and she sat the saddle stiff as a fence post, and the gentle old mare Garrett put her on could feel every ounce of her fear. But she didn't quit. He'd give her that. She fell once hard into the dust, and Hattie came running, and Lydia waved her off and climbed back up with her teeth gritted and her stitched side white with pain, and said only, again. You don't have to prove nothing to me, Garrett said. I'm not proving it to you. She gathered the reins. Again. By the 3rd day, she could ride well enough to follow him. By the 4th, they rode out to the Reyes place at the South River. And that was where the thing stopped being a story Lydia told, and became a thing Garrett saw with his own eyes. The Reyes family met them with shotguns. Garrett expected that. He kept his hands visible and let Lydia do the talking. And when the old man Tomas Reyes recognized her, recognized the clerk who'd once come with Voss's man to explain the papers, he spat in the dirt and told her in 2 languages to get off his land. I'm not with them anymore, Lydia said. I ran. Look. She pulled back her sleeves and showed the marks on her wrists, still livid. They did this, because I took the proof. Mr. Reyes, the note they're holding over you, it's forged. Your wife's signature on it. She never signed it, did she? The old man went still. She can't write her name, he said hoarsely. 40 years married. She makes a mark, an X. That paper has her name written out full. His voice cracked. I told the assessor. I told him she can't write. He said it didn't matter. He said the law was the law. It matters, Lydia said. It's the proof. A signature she couldn't have made. That's how we break it. And Tomas Reyes, a hard old man who'd met them with a shotgun, put his face in his hands and wept, because for 2 years he'd been told the truth didn't matter, and here was a stranger telling him it did. It was the same at the Ostrander place. The same with the Delphs. One after another, families who'd been picked off in the dark, who'd each thought they were the only one, who'd each been told they'd defaulted, signed, agreed, owed. And each of them carried some small, impossible detail, a signature from a dead man, a date that fell on a Sunday when the bank was closed, a debt for cattle they'd never bought that Lydia could point to and name. By the end of the week, Garrett had a list of 9 families and a cold fury banked low in his chest that frightened even him. It's bigger than the south of the river, he told Lydia, the 2 of them sitting on the porch as the heat finally broke for evening. Voss didn't just take a few poor folks' land. This is the whole valley. He's been building it for years. I know. I kept the books. She was quiet a moment. There's something I haven't told you, because I wasn't sure you'd believe it, and I needed you to believe everything else first. Garrett looked at her. He didn't pick the ranches at random, Lydia said. Somebody told him which ones, which families were weak, which widows were alone, which men drank or owed or had no kin to fight for them. Somebody who knew this valley from the inside. Voss isn't from here. He couldn't have known. Who? I don't have a name. The marked ledger only had initials by the survey notes. The man who scouted the properties. Every entry in the take list had the same initials beside it. She watched his face carefully. J.M. And Garrett Hale went very still. J.M., he repeated. You know who it is. He didn't answer. He stood up off the porch rail and walked out into the yard and stood with his back to her. And Lydia, who had learned in 2 years to read the silence of guilty men, watched his shoulders and felt something cold open up in her stomach. Mr. Hale, who is J.M.? Jeb Marsh, Garrett said, not turning around. My foreman, for 9 years, ran this whole spread. When I was laid up the winter I broke my leg. Knows every family on this mountain by name. Knows who's strong and who's weak. Knows who drinks. His voice had gone to gravel. Knows my south pasture borders the Crane place because I told him so myself. Where is he now? Left in the spring, said he had family back east. Garrett laughed low and awful. I gave him a bonus, shook his hand, told him he was the best foreman I ever had, and the door was always open. Lydia stood slow, her hand pressed to her stitched side. Garrett. It was the first time she'd used his name. He sold us all, Garrett said. Sold the whole mountain to Voss. Marked my own ranch for the taken and shook my hand and rode off east with my bonus in his pocket and a list of every weak family I ever helped him learn. He turned around at last, and his face was a thing Lydia would not forget. I trusted that man more than any living soul. I'd have given him a kidney. That's not on you. You couldn't have known. That's the part you don't understand yet, Miss Cross. His voice was terribly quiet. It's always somebody you trust. That's how it works. The speculators who took my daddy's land, you know how they found out which families were behind on their taxes. Our own neighbor told them, a man who'd eaten at our table. That's the whole machine right there. They don't need armies. They just need one man on the inside who'll look at his boots and take the money. The two of them stood in the failing light, and the size of the thing settled over them. Not 9 families now, but a whole valley. Not a stranger's crime, but a betrayal that ran straight through Garrett's own front door. Then he can be made to talk, Lydia said. Garrett looked at her sharp. Jeb Marsh, she said. If he scouted the properties, his name is in the take list. His initials anyway. But more than that, he knows where Voss keeps things. He knows the men. He's a witness, Garrett. A witness from the inside, same as me. One clerk and one foreman both turned. Voss can call me a liar. He can't call us both liars and keep a straight face. He left in the spring. He's halfway to the Atlantic by now. Is he? Lydia's eyes had gone bright with something that was either hope or fever. A man who marked a whole valley for seizure. You think Voss let his scout just ride off east? You think he turned loose the one man who could hang him? No. She shook her head slowly. If I know Harlan Voss, and I kept his books 2 years, so I do, Jeb Marsh never left this territory. He's tucked away somewhere close where Voss can watch him until the last note comes due and the last ranch is taken. And then a man who knows too much has an accident, Garrett finished. Yes. The wind came up off the ridges, the first cool breath of the night, and it moved through the yard between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. So we find him first, Garrett said. We find him first. Before Voss decides he's done being useful. Before that. Lydia hesitated. Garrett, if we go looking for Jeb Marsh, we're not building this slow and quiet anymore. We're putting our hands right in the fire. Voss will know. The sheriff will know. Everything changes the minute we start asking after that man. Garrett looked out at the dark shape of the mountain, the land he'd thought he'd made safe, the land he'd thought no man could ever take from him again. He'd been wrong. The note was already written. August was already coming. The machine had been grinding toward his door the whole time he'd told himself he was careful. It already changed, he said. Changed the minute I tore that closet door off its latch. There's no slow and quiet anymore, Miss Cross. There's just whether we get to Jeb Marsh before they put him in the ground with the truth still in his mouth. Inside the house. Hattie was lighting the lamps, and the warm yellow light fell out across the porch boards, and somewhere down the valley, miles off, a single rider was already spurring hard toward Sage Bend, with the news that the runaway clerk wasn't dead in a closet. After all, that she was up the mountain alive in the house of the richest man in the county, and that the two of them had spent a week riding to every robbed family in the valley and writing down their names. Garrett didn't know about that writer yet. But Lydia, who knew exactly how fast bad news traveled in Harlan Voss's country, turned her face toward the dark road below and felt the cold settle deeper in her stomach, because she understood something Garrett was still learning. They were not hunting Jeb Marsh anymore. They had just become the hunted. The rider reached Sage Bend a little after midnight, and by the time the sun was up, Harlan Voss knew everything. Garrett learned it the way a man learns the weather has turned, by the silence. He rode down to the Delph place that next morning to take Old Man Delph's statement proper, and the Delphs were gone. Door standing open, stove cold, a child's shoe left in the dirt of the yard. They ran, Lydia said softly, sitting her mare beside him. Or they were made to run, or something worse. Garrett swung down and walked the empty yard, and he found the wheel ruts fresh-headed, not east toward freedom, but west toward town. They didn't run. Somebody came and took him in the night. Voss is collecting his witnesses before we can. Then he knows. He knows. Garrett looked up at her. Which means we got no more time to be careful. We find Jeb Marsh today, or we don't find him alive at all. It took them till dusk. Lydia had been right. Marsh had never left the territory. A boy who herded goats up near the old Callaway mine told them for 2 bits that there was a man living in the line shack above the played-out diggings. A man who never came down. A man 2 of Voss's hands brought supplies to every Sunday, and nobody else ever saw. A prisoner that don't know he's a prisoner, Garrett said grimly. Or one that does and can't do nothing about it. They went up at last light on foot, the final stretch, Garrett with his rifle, and Lydia with her teeth set. There was one guard dozing against the shack wall with a bottle in his lap. Garrett took the bottle, the man's gun, and the man's dignity, all in about 4 seconds, and left him trussed in the brush with his own belt. Then he kicked the door. Jeb Marsh came up off the cot with his hands raised before he even saw who it was. That told them plenty. A man only learns to wake up with his hands raised after somebody's taught him to. Then he saw Garrett's face in the doorway, and every drop of color went out of him. "No," Jeb whispered. "No, Garrett. Garrett, Hello, Jeb. You shouldn't be here. God Almighty, you shouldn't be here. They'll kill us both. They'll—" He saw Lydia then behind Garrett, and his knees gave out, and he sat down hard on the cot. "The clerk. They said you were dead. They said the girl was dead." "Disappointing, ain't it?" Lydia said. Garrett crossed the little room in 2 steps and stood over the man he'd trusted 9 years, the man he'd given a bonus and a handshake, and for a moment, Lydia thought he might kill him with his bare hands. Garrett thought it too. His fists were shaking. 9 years, Garrett said. You sat at my table. You ran my ranch when I couldn't walk. And you sold every family on this mountain to Harlan Voss. Sold me. Marked my own land for the taken. Garrett, tell me why. You owe me that much. You owe me one true word before I decide what to do with you. Why? And Jeb Marsh, foreman, betrayer, prisoner in a played-out mine, put his face in his hands and told them. My boy, he said. My boy Samuel, back in Missouri. He's sick. Garrett been sick since he was born, something with his lungs, and there's a doctor in St. Louis says he can fix it, but it costs more money than a foreman makes in 20 years. His voice broke. Voss found out. Voss finds out everything. He came to me and he said he'd pay for the boy. All of it. The doctor, the medicines, all of it. He just needed me to tell him a few things about the valley. Which families, which widows, which men drank. He looked up and his eyes were wet and ruined. I told myself it weren't no real harm. They were just papers. I told myself nobody'd really get hurt. Nobody'd get hurt, Garrett repeated. And then I saw what he did with what I gave him. Jeb's whole body shuddered. And I tried to stop. I told him I was through. That's when he brought me up here. Said I could leave when the last note came due. We both know what happens to me then. I'm the only man besides that clerk who can put a rope around his neck. I'm a dead man, Garrett. I've been a dead man since spring. He wiped his face. Is the boy even still getting the medicine? I don't know. He won't tell me. He just dangles it. That's how he works. He found the thing I loved, and he put a price on it. The shack was quiet. Lydia spoke first, and her voice was gentler than Garrett expected. "That's exactly how he works," she said. "He found the thing I couldn't stand, people being robbed in the dark, and he made me the hand that did it 2 years before I broke. He doesn't hire crooks, Mr. Marsh. He hires good people, and he finds the one thing they'd damn themselves for. It's almost the worst part." Garrett looked at her, and something passed between them, an understanding. Then he looked back down at Jeb Marsh, and the killing had gone out of his hands. "Here's the truth of it, Jeb," he said. "I can't forgive you. Not today. Maybe not ever. But I can use you." He crouched down to the man's level. "You want to make it right. You can't buy your boy's lungs back with what you did. But you can put Harlan Voss where he can't price another man's son. You testify, in front of the whole town. Everything you just told me, and everything you know about how he does it. He'll kill Samuel. He won't be able to kill anybody from a cell or a gallows," Garrett said. "That's the only protection your boy's ever gonna have. You think Voss keeps his word about the doctor? You said it yourself. He just dangles it. The only way to save your boy is to take away the man holding him hostage. There's no other road, Jeb. There never was." For a long, terrible moment, Jeb Marsh looked at the floor of the shack. "I'd have to stand up in front of all of them," he said hoarsely. "Everybody. And say what I am. Yes. They'll hate me. Probably. But your boy won't have to grow up the son of the man who let Voss win." Garrett stood and held out his hand, the same hand he'd shaken in the spring in betrayal, the hand he was now offering across it. "One true thing, Jeb. Do one true thing." And Jeb Marsh, after everything, took the hand. They got him down off the mountain that night. And the next morning, the thing they'd all been racing toward came down out of the sky like a hawk. Harlan Voss posted notices in every shop window and nailed one to the church door itself, a public auction. The defaulted properties of the Dominion Land Company sold lawful and opened the Saturday following on the steps of the courthouse in Sage Bend. All welcome. A territorial circuit judge in attendance to confirm clear title. Refreshments to be served. "He's not hiding anymore," Garrett said, reading the notice with Lydia at his side. "He's doing the opposite. He's going to take all of it at once in broad daylight in front of everybody with a judge to bless it. Make it so legal, nobody can ever question it." A circuit judge. Lydia had gone pale. "Garrett, there's no circuit judge due in this district till the fall. I kept the court calendar for him. Whoever he's bringing is bought," Garrett finished. "Of course he is. A bought judge to bless a stolen valley." He folded the notice slowly. "He's not making a mistake, Lydia. He's making a coronation." "Then we don't fight the auction," Lydia said suddenly. "We don't stop it. We let it happen." Garrett looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Listen to me." She gripped his arm. "Everything Voss does works in the dark. One family at a time, one private deal where nobody can see. The auction is the one time, the only time he's pulling all of it into the light himself. Every stolen ranch named out loud in one place in front of the whole town. He thinks the light protects him because he's got a judge. But the light's our weapon too, if we're ready for it. He's gathering every victim's name in one room for us. We just have to make the room ours." Garrett was quiet a long moment. "You want to spring it at the auction," he said. "In front of everybody. In front of everybody. Where he can't tie it up in a closet or take it in the night. The whole town watching. His own judge sitting there. And the truth standing up where every soul in Sage Bend has to choose out loud whether to look at it or look at their boots." Her eyes were burning. "I'm done being taken in the dark, Garrett. Let's drag him into the sun." So they built it. 4 days. Fast and quiet and breathless. Lydia rode. She could ride now hard, the woman who'd never sat a horse 2 weeks before, to the families that hadn't been collected yet, and she gathered them, Tomas Reyes and his wife, who could only make her mark the Ostranders, the Cranes' old Mrs. Bell, whose dead husband had somehow co-signed a mortgage. Witnesses. Each one carrying a single impossible fact. Garrett rode 2 counties over to find Judge Amos Whitfield, retired these 6 years, a man with no love for Harlan Voss, and a reputation so clean. Even Voss couldn't buy or break it, a real judge to sit in the crowd and watch a false one work. And the night before the auction, Lydia did the most dangerous thing of all. She went back to St. Anne's. She went alone against Garrett's furious objection, because she said one woman slipping into a church at night drew less notice than a rich man and a known fugitive, and she was right, and it didn't make it any easier for Garrett to let her go. She came back near dawn, mud to the knees, shaking with the oxblood ledger wrapped in oilcloth against her body. "They'd searched the church," she whispered when she was safe inside Garrett's kitchen with Hattie's hands on her shoulders. "Garrett, they'd torn the choir room apart. Floor pulled up. Robes everywhere. They knew it was there. But they didn't find it. The loose stone held." She set the ledger on the table with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. "An inch. They missed it by an inch. If I'd hidden it any sloppier—" She couldn't finish. Garrett looked at the cracked oxblood spine, the green ink visible at the page edges, 2 years of stolen lives written down in one man's careful hand, and he understood that everything, every family, every name, Lydia's life, his own land came down to this one water-stained book, and whether they could get it to the courthouse steps without Voss's men taking it on the road. "He'll have men watching every approach to town," Garrett said. "If they see us carrying anything, they'll take it." That was when Caleb Stroud the blacksmith spoke up, a huge quiet man who'd lost a cousin to a forged note and who'd come up the mountain to stand with them. "Then don't carry it," Stroud said. "I take a grain wagon into town every Saturday. Voss's own hands help me unload it for his horses. I'll carry your book to the courthouse under 200 pounds of oats, and his own men'll do the liftin'." And Garrett Hale, for the first time in longer than he could remember, laughed out loud. Saturday came hot and bright, and all of Sage Bend turned out for the auction, because Voss had promised refreshments and a show, and the town had a long habit of coming when Voss called. He'd built a platform on the courthouse steps. He stood on it in a fine gray coat, and beside him sat his judge, a soft, smiling man in black who'd never held court in this district in his life, and behind him stood Sheriff Del Cobb with his thumbs in his belt and his eyes on the crowd. The collected families, the ones Voss had taken in the night, stood penned to one side like cattle watched by hired men. Lydia stood at the back of the crowd in Hattie's plain bonnet, her face hidden, her heart going like a hammer. Garrett stood not far from her, and somewhere in the press of bodies were Tomas Reyes and the Ostranders and old Mrs. Bell, and seated on a bench at the front, unremarked, was a tired-looking old man nobody recognized as Judge Amos Whitfield, and parked at the courthouse hitching rail was a grain wagon, and beside it, mopping his face, was Caleb Stroud. Voss began to read. He read the first property, the Reyes place, in a smooth, carrying voice, the forged debt, the default, the lawful seizure, and his judge nodded and stamped a paper and declared the title clear. The crowd shifted, uneasy and silent. Some looked at the penned families. Most looked at their boots. He read the second, the third, and on the fourth, Lydia Cross took off her bonnet and stepped forward and called out in a voice that cracked the morning open, "Read the rest of it, Mr. Voss. Read the name on the next one, out loud. Read whose it is." The whole crowd turned. Voss's smooth voice stopped. For just a heartbeat, one single heartbeat, Lydia saw the mask slip, saw the pure cold hatred underneath before the smile came back. "Ah," Voss said. "The runaway. Folks, this is the very thief I warned you about. A clerk I dismissed for stealing from the company. She's come to disrupt lawful business with lies. Sheriff." Sheriff Cobb stepped forward, and his hand dropped to his gun. "If I'm a thief," Lydia said, not moving, her voice ringing off the courthouse stone, "then read the names aloud, all of them. You've got nothing to fear from a liar. Do you read Mrs. Reyes's name on that mortgage? Then ask her to sign it again right here so the whole town can watch. She can't, Mr. Voss. She can't write her name. She makes a mark. 40 years. So who signed that paper? Who held her hand and wrote her name?" A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. Tomas Reyes pushed forward. "It's true," he shouted. "My wife can't write, that paper's a lie." "And Henry Bell co-signed Mrs. Bell's note in March." Lydia went on louder, faster, before Voss could speak. "Henry Bell, who's buried in your own churchyard since January. Dead men don't sign mortgages. Dig him up and ask him." "Lies," Voss started. "Then read the names." Lydia screamed it now. If they're not lies, read them. The sheriff drew his gun, and Garrett Hale stepped out of the crowd and into the open ground between Lydia and the sheriff's barrel, and the whole town went dead silent, because everyone in Sage Bend knew the richest man in the county, and everyone knew he did not stand in front of guns for runaway clerks. "Go on, Dell," Garrett said quietly. "Shoot her. In front of everybody. In front of a real judge." He half-turned and lifted his hand, and old Amos Whitfield rose stiffly from the front bench. "Folks, this here's Judge Amos Whitfield, 20 years on the territorial bench, retired honest as the day. He came 2 counties to watch this auction. Judge, that man in black up there, you know him." Whitfield's voice was dry and clear. "I know him. His name's Pell. He was disbarred in '79 for selling judgments. He's no more a circuit judge than my mule." The crowd erupted, and up on the platform, the false Judge Pell was already gathering his black coat to flee, and Sheriff Cobb's gun was swinging now from Lydia to Garrett to the suddenly hostile crowd, and Harlan Voss's smooth gray calm had finally completely cracked. "The book," Voss shouted to his men. "Find the girl's book. She's got nothing without the—" "You mean this one?" Caleb Stroud's voice came like a church bell. He stood at the back of the platform, having climbed up unseen during the chaos, and in his huge blacksmith's hands he held the oxblood ledger, oilcloth fallen away the cracked spine, and the green ink there for the whole town to see. "Carried it to your door in your own oats, Voss. Your own men helped me lift it down. For one frozen instant nobody moved. Then everyone did." Voss lunged for the ledger. Stroud swung it out of reach. The sheriff's gun came up. Garrett was already moving, throwing himself sideways to put his body between the barrel and Lydia, and the crowd surged and screamed, and Old Man Reyes grabbed at one of the hired men, and somewhere a gun went off, the sound flat and enormous, and the platform railing splintered, and Harlan Voss tore the ledger from Caleb Stroud's grip, in the confusion clutched it to his chest, and ran. He came down off the platform fast for a man his age, the oxblood book hugged against his fine gray coat, shoving through the panicking crowd toward the alley where his horse stood saddled and waiting, because Harlan Voss never went anywhere without a way out. And as he ran, he was already shouting for the sheriff, for his men, for anyone, his smooth voice gone to a ragged animal scream. Garrett came up off of the ground with Lydia's hand gripped in his, and he saw the gray coat vanishing into the alley. Saw the green ink and the cracked oxblood spine going with it. Every name, every proof, every robbed family's only hope clutched in the arms of the one man who would burn it to ash the moment he was clear of the crowd. "He's got the ledger," Lydia gasped. "Garrett, he's got the ledger. If it burns, we have nothing. The families have nothing." But Garrett Hale was already running. He cleared the alley 3 strides behind the gray coat and saw Voss swing up onto the waiting horse, the ledger jammed inside his coat against his chest, and then the animal was wheeling and bolting north out of town toward the high country, and Voss was gone in a boil of dust. Garrett's own horse was a half-block back at Pruitt's rail. He ran for it, tore the reins loose, and was in the saddle before his boot found the second stirrup. Garrett. Lydia was running toward him, skirts hiked. Hattie's bonnet long gone. "Take me, don't you leave me behind, Garrett Hale." "Lydia, he's armed, he's running, this is gonna get—" "That book has my whole life in it, and every family I ever failed to save in time. I'm not standing in a courthouse yard while you ride off with it. Now reach down, or I'll take Stroud's wagon horse and follow you slower and stupider." There was no time to argue, and they both knew it. Garrett reached down, caught her arm, and swung her up behind him, and she got her arms around his waist, and her face against his back, and he put the spurs in. Behind them, Sage Bend dissolved into chaos, the false judge fleeing the crowd, turning on the penned guards, old Amos Whitfield's voice rising over all of it, demanding order in the name of the territory. Garrett didn't look back. He'd stopped looking back the day he tore that closet door off its latch, and there was only one direction left that mattered now, and it was north into the mountains after a gray coat and a cracked oxblood book. "He's making for the pass," Lydia shouted over the wind and the hammer of hooves. "The Callaway Pass, it's the only way out of the valley going north." "I know it. I've gathered cattle in it 20 years. Garrett bent low. "He don't know it half as well as he thinks. There's a switchback above the gorge'll slow any man who don't know where the trail folds. The chase ran out of the heat of the valley and up into the high country, where the air went thin and cool, and ahead of them, the sky was doing a thing. Garrett had seen 100 summers piling up black and bruised over the peaks, the afternoon storm coming on fast and mean, the first far growl of thunder rolling down the canyons. Voss, Garrett's horse, was gaining fresher and better bred and not carrying a panicked man's whipping. "Voss, you can't outrun it. Pull up." Voss did not pull up. Voss looked back once, his fine gray face gone white, and lashed his horse harder, and that was his mistake, because the trail ahead was the switchback, and a man flogging a frightened animal into a fold of mountain. He doesn't know is a man about to come to grief. The gray horse balked at the lip of the gorge. Voss hauled it round too hard. It slipped on the loose shale and went down screaming, and Voss came off it and rolled, and the ledger spilled out of his coat into the dirt, 3 feet from the edge of a drop that fell 200 feet to white water. Garrett was off his own horse before it stopped. "Don't!" he roared. "Voss, don't touch it." But Voss was already scrambling on his hands and knees, lunging for the book. He got it. He came up to his feet with the oxblood ledger clutched to his chest, and his back to the gorge, and his other hand came out of his coat with a small nickel pistol in it, and he leveled it at Garrett's heart. And for the first time all afternoon, Harlan Voss smiled. "Far enough, Hale." Garrett stopped. He put himself between the pistol and Lydia, without seeming to move at all. "It's over, Voss," he said. "Whitfield's got your judge. The town saw the names. Half your hired men are running for the territory line right now. It's done. It's done when I say it's done." Voss was breathing hard, but the smile held, and that was the frightening thing. The man genuinely believed it. You think a courthouse tantrum and one retired judge undoes 20 years of legal work. Every one of those deeds is filed. Hale. Recorded. Stamped. The only thing in this world that says otherwise is right here in my hand. He hefted the ledger. And in about 1 minute it's going to be at the bottom of that gorge, and then it's the word of a runaway clerk and a traitor foreman against a column of recorded lawful titles. Who do you think the courts believe the paper? They always believe the paper. Then we'll get the families to... The families! Voss laughed, and it was an ugly sound. Half of them already signed settlements. I made sure of that this week while you were playing rescuer up your mountain. They took my money rather than risk losing everything. They sold you out, Hale, same as everyone always does, because that's what frightened people do. He took a step back toward the edge. I'm going to drop this book. And there is not one thing you can do about it, because if you so much as twitch, I put a bullet in you, and then in her. Lydia's voice came from behind Garrett's shoulder, steady low. Henry Bell's name. Voss blinked. What? You can drop the ledger, Lydia said, stepping out beside Garrett, though he tried to hold her back. Drop it. Burn it. It doesn't matter as much as you think, because I kept your books 2 years. Harlan, and you taught me the one thing you never meant to. You taught me that you can't steal a man's land in the open. You have to do it in the dark, one at a time, where nobody sees. Well, she lifted her chin. Everybody saw today. The whole town. They watched Mrs. Reyes, who can't write her name. They watched Judge Whitfield call your judge a fraud. You can sink that book and it changes nothing because the dark's gone now. You can't put a town back to sleep once it's woke up. Voss's smile faltered. And in that half-second of faltering, a shape came up over the lip of the switchback behind him. A man on a lathered horse who'd followed the dust the whole way up from town. A man who'd been told to stay safe, and hadn't a man with one true thing left to do. Jeb Marsh. Voss. Jeb screamed it, and threw himself off the horse straight at the man who'd bought his son's lungs and his own soul. Voss spun. The pistol cracked. Jeb took the bullet full in the chest, and his weight carried both of them backward toward the edge, and the ledger flew from Voss's hand and skidded Garrett Dove, and caught it by the corner with his fingertips an inch from the drop. And Voss and Jeb went down together in a tangle at the very lip of the gorge. Jeb saw. Garrett had the book. He lunged again, grabbing for the men, and caught Jeb's collar just as Voss kicked free and scrambled back from the edge, panting, the pistol gone, his fine coat torn, his eyes wild. Garrett hauled Jeb back from the drop. The foreman's chest was a ruin. There wasn't going to be any saving it, and all three of them knew it in the first second. Did I? Jeb's voice was a wet whisper. Did I do it? Did I do one true thing? You did, Jeb. Garrett had him in his arms, and his own voice had broken clean in half. You did. You saved the book. You saved them all. You hear me? Every family on the mountain. You did it. Samuel, Jeb breathed. My boy. He'll know. Lydia was on her knees in the dirt beside them, and she had the dying man's hand in both of hers. He'll know his father stopped Harlan Voss. I swear it on my own life, Jeb Marsh. He'll grow up knowing exactly what you did up here today. Jeb Marsh smiled just a little. And then he was gone. The storm broke over the pass. Garrett laid the foreman down gentle in the dirt and closed his eyes, and then he rose slow with the oxblood ledger in one hand, and he turned to Harlan Voss, and his other hand drew his gun. Voss was on his knees at the edge of the gorge, unarmed, now his pistol lost over the side, his whole 20-year empire reduced to a wet, gasping man in a torn gray coat in the rain. He looked up at Garrett standing over him with the gun, and for the first time the smooth confidence was wholly finally gone. What was left underneath was just an ordinary, frightened, ugly little man. You won't do it, Voss said, and even now he was reaching for the angle, the bargain, the way out. You're not a killer, Hale. You're a rancher. You'll hand me to the law, and the law is mine, and I'll be free inside a... Garrett cocked the gun. Garrett, Lydia's voice, quiet behind him. He didn't lower it. His hand was steady as stone. Voss had bought Jeb's soul with a sick child's lungs. Voss had tied her in a closet to die. Voss had marked his father's blood and his own land, and the whole Green Valley for the taking, and he was kneeling right there in the mud, and 1 ounce of pressure ended it forever, and every part of Garrett Hale that had spent 20 years going hard wanted to pull that trigger more than it had ever wanted anything. Garrett, look at me. Lydia came around to where he could see her face. She was soaked, and Jeb's blood was on her hands, and she'd never looked at him so steadily. If you kill him here on this mountain with no one watching but us and a dead man. What is it? It's a feud. Rich rancher guns down a businessman in a land dispute. That's the story they'll tell. That's the story Voss would tell if he could. They'll bury what he did under what you did, and his name comes out cleaner than yours. He killed Jeb. He'd have killed you. I know what he did. Her voice cracked but held. I know it better than you. He nearly killed me in the dark, and the dark is the only place he was ever strong. So don't give him the dark, Garrett. Don't kill him up here where nobody sees. If he dies on this mountain, they call it a feud. She reached out slow and laid her bloody hand over the barrel of the gun, not pushing it down, just resting it there. But if he stands trial in the open in front of the whole territory, with that book read out loud, and every family naming what he took, then they'll have to call it what it was. Theft, forgery, murder. They'll have to say it out loud in the light forever. That's not revenge, Garrett. That's worse than revenge for a man like him. That's the truth, and it's permanent, and he can't run from it or buy it or burn it. The rain came down. Voss knelt in it, watching his life balance on the steadiness of another man's hand. And Garrett Hale, who had wanted to be a killer for exactly 1 minute of his life, eased the hammer down and holstered the gun. You're right, he said low. He don't get the dark, not even at the end of it. He hauled Harlan Voss up by the torn collar of his fine gray coat, none too gentle, and bound the man's wrists with a length of his own saddle rope. And if he tied them a little tighter than he had to, well, Lydia didn't say a word about it. They came down off of the mountain in the rain, 3 living and 1 dead. Garrett leading Voss's horse with the bound man slung over it, and Jeb Marsh wrapped in a slicker behind, and Lydia rode close beside Garrett with the oxblood ledger held against her body, the way she'd once held it running from a closet, except this time she wasn't running, and this time she wasn't alone. What met them at the foot of the pass changed everything. Riders. A dozen of them coming up the valley road hard, and Garrett's hand went to his gun before he saw the sun catch the badges on their chests. Real ones, federal ones, and saw the woman riding at their head, a small, fierce woman in a traveling coat with a notebook strapped to her saddle. That's Miss Avery, Lydia breathed. The newspaper woman. From the auction garret she got out, she rode for the wire office. The newspaper woman. Cora Avery reined up in front of them, took in the bound man and the body, and the soaked, exhausted pair, and turned to the marshal beside her. "That's him," she said. "That's Harlan Voss. And that," she pointed at the oilcloth bundle against Lydia's chest, "is the ledger I told you about, the one with everything in it." The lead marshal, a grizzled man with territorial authority in the set of his shoulders, looked at Garrett. "You'd be Hale. Miss Avery wired Denver from the auction floor before Voss's men cut the line. Said there was a fraud here bigger than anything in the territory's history, and a clerk who could prove it." He nodded at Lydia. "That you, ma'am?" "That's me," Lydia said, and her voice didn't shake at all. "Lydia Cross. I kept Harlan Voss's books for 2 years. And every single thing in this ledger is true, and I'll swear to all of it, and so will 9 families, and so will a dead man's testimony. I took down myself 2 nights ago." The marshal looked at Voss, slung bound over his own horse. "And Sheriff Cobb, sittin' in his own jail last I saw," Garrett said. "The town put him there. Judge Whitfield's holding things together down below. You'll want to talk to a disbarred lawyer named Pell, too, was up on that platform pretending to be a circuit judge." The marshal almost smiled. "Sounds like you folks have had a busy morning." It was not finished that day. Lydia had been right about that from the start. Justice was not a single shot fired on a mountain. It was slow, and it was paperwork, and it was hard. It took the territorial court 4 months to work through the Oxblood ledger. 4 months of testimony of families coming forward. One frightened soul at a time, once they saw the first ones weren't struck down for it. Cora Avery's newspaper printed the names a column at a time, week after week, until a town that had spent years looking at its boots couldn't look anywhere but at the truth. Sheriff Del Cobb was convicted of conspiracy and sent east to a federal prison. The false Judge Pell hanged himself in his cell before his trial. Elias Pruitt, the storekeeper, who'd kept a woman in his closet because "a man's got to live in this town," was never charged with anything, but no one in Sage Bend ever bought a nail from him again, and within the year his store stood empty, and that was a kind of justice too. Harlan Voss did not buy his way free, the way he'd promised he would. He stood trial in the open in the light, with the ledger, read out loud, page by page, and green-inked name by name, exactly as Lydia had sworn he would. Tomas Reyes testified. His wife came forward, and before the whole court made her mark the only mark she could make, beside the full forged signature on her stolen deed, and the gallery wept. Old Mrs. Bell told them about her dead husband's impossible co-signing. One after another in the sunlight, they named what Voss had taken until the thing he'd built in the dark over 20 years could never again be called anything but what it was. Not all of it could be undone. That was the truth, and Garrett made sure Lydia never let herself forget it or blame herself for it. Some land had already been resold to honest buyers who couldn't be turned out. Some families had taken Voss's settlement money and signed away their claims and couldn't get them back. Some wounds simply don't close no matter how the verdict reads, but the Reyes family got their land. So did the Cranes and the Ostranders and old Mrs. Bell. The forged lien on Garrett's south pasture was struck from the record, and the $1,100 he'd never borrowed vanished like the lie it had always been. And Harlan Voss went to a federal prison for the rest of his natural life, which for a man who had to be the largest figure in every room he entered, was perhaps a harsher sentence than the gorge would ever have been. They buried Jeb Marsh on the mountain in good ground with a view of the valley he'd betrayed, and then, at the very last, saved. Garrett paid for the stone himself, and he had them carve no apology on it and no excuse. Only the man's name, and his dates, and 3 words underneath that. Lydia chose, "He did one true thing." And in St. Louis, a doctor who had been receiving anonymous payments for a sick boy's lungs found the payments did not stop because Garrett Hale, the richest man in the county, had quietly arranged it the very week the trial ended, and arranged, too, that the boy and his mother would be told when he was old enough to understand it the whole truth of what his father had done and undone on a mountain pass in the rain. The evening, it was all finally over. The verdict read, and the valley quiet. Garrett found Lydia sitting on his porch with the Oxblood ledger closed on her lap, watching the last light come down gold over the ridges. He sat beside her and didn't say anything for a long while, because there were things between them now that didn't need saying yet. "I keep thinking about what you said up on the pass," he told her finally. "About the dark. About how he was only ever strong in the dark. I learned it from him." She didn't look away from the ridges. 2 years of his books. It was the only useful thing he ever taught me. "It's the most useful thing anybody ever taught me," Garrett said. "And I'm 39 years old." Lydia turned and looked at him, then really looked the way she hadn't let herself look at any man since long before a closet in Sage Bend, and something in her face that had been clenched tight as a fist for 2 long years finally slowly began to open. "It's not finished, you know," she said softly. "It's never really finished. Somewhere there's another Harlan Voss, and another valley, and another family being picked off one at a time in the dark, because everybody around them would rather look at their boots." "I know it," Garrett said. "So what do we do about that?" And Garrett Hale looked out over his land, the land he'd nearly lost the land. A dying man had helped him keep the land that had been a fortress for one closed-off man, and had somehow this strange and terrible summer become something else entirely. "We make sure," he said slowly, "that the next time somebody comes through this valley carrying the truth and bleeding for it, they got somewhere to go." The first one came at the end of summer, while the cottonwoods were still green. She came up the valley road on a borrowed mule with 2 children behind her and everything she owned in a flour sack. And she stopped at Garrett's gate, the way a woman stops when she's run out of places to stop. And Lydia, who happened to be on the porch, knew that posture in her bones because she'd worn it herself once at a different gate. "They told me in town," the woman said, not getting down off the mule, not daring to hope that far. "They told me there's a ranch up the mountain where a body can come if a land company's got its hand on her throat. They told me to ask for the clerk who beat Harlan Voss." Her voice wobbled. "Is that you, ma'am? Are you the clerk?" Lydia came down the steps. "I'm the clerk," she said. "Get down off that mule and bring those babies inside. Hattie's got biscuits, and we've got all the time in the world to hear what they've done to you." That was how it started. Not with a grand opening or a sign on a door, but with one frightened woman and a rumor that had grown legs and walked itself across 2 counties that there was a place. That somebody would listen. That the dark wasn't the only thing left. By the first frost, there'd been 6 of them. Garrett gave over the bunkhouse he no longer needed for all the hands he'd let go, and Hattie ran a kitchen that never quite stopped. And Lydia did the thing she was made for. She sat at the kitchen table with each new arrival and their crumpled, terrible papers, and she read. She found the forged dates, and the dead men's signatures, and the debts for cattle never bought county by county. The same machine grinding in a dozen valleys under a dozen different names because Harlan Voss had been a method, not a man, and the method had outlived him. "It's everywhere," she told Garrett one night, the lamp low, a stack of stolen lives between them. "It's not just our valley. Voss learned it from somebody, and that somebody taught 100 Vosses, and they're working every poor county between here and the coast." "Then we'd best get organized," Garrett said. So Lydia opened the records office. It was 2 small rooms in Sage Bend, right on the main street, with a sign in the window that said simply, "Cross Land Records and Contracts, Read Free," and the meaning of it was plain to every soul in town. Before you sign anything a company puts in front of you, bring it here, and a woman who knows their tricks will tell you the truth of it for nothing. The town did not all love her for it. Some did. The Reyes family brought her vegetables every week and would have given her the moon. But there were others, men who'd done business with Voss, and prospered men who'd looked at their boots for years and didn't care to be reminded of it every time they passed her window, who muttered that the clerk woman was stirring up trouble, that she made folks suspicious, that a town ran smoother when people minded their own. "You're not making yourself popular," Garrett observed the day he came to fix a sticking hinge on her office door. "I didn't beat Harlan Voss to be popular." She didn't look up from the deed she was reading. "Popular is just the dark wearing a friendly hat, Garrett. Popular is what got that whole town staring at their boots while you carried me out of a closet." He couldn't argue with that. He'd stopped trying to argue with her about much of anything. It was one of the things he'd come to. He wasn't ready to use the word, not yet, not even to himself, about Lydia Cross. Then, in the dead of the following winter, The letter came that nearly took it all back. It was Cora Avery, the newspaper woman who brought it up the mountain through the snow, her face grim. "Appeal," she said before she'd even shaken the cold off. "Voss's conviction. There's an appeal filed in the Territorial High Court, and it's not Voss filing it, because Voss hasn't got $2 left to his name." She slapped the paper down on Garrett's table. "It's funded out of Chicago. There's a syndicate back east, the men who put up the money behind Dominion in the first place. The real money. They never set foot in this valley, and not one of their names is on a single deed. They let Voss take all the risk and all the blame, and now they're spending a fortune to overturn his conviction, because if Voss's conviction stands, every Dominion title in 6 territories is poisoned. They stand to lose everything they stole everywhere." Lydia had gone very still. "They can't overturn it. The ledger, the testimony. They can if the witnesses won't stand by it." Cora's voice was flat. "And that's their plan. They're not fighting the facts, Lydia. They're too smart for that. They're sending a man, a lawyer named Thorne out of Chicago, with a war chest the size of a cattle ranch, and his whole job is to come into this valley quiet and friendly, and make the witnesses go soft before the appeal is heard. A little money here, a little fear there. Get enough of them to say, 'Well, maybe I misremembered,' and the High Court throws the whole thing out and Voss walks and everything you built comes down." The kitchen was silent but for the fire. "The dark," Garrett said quietly. "He's bringing back the dark. Different man, same trick." "Exactly the same trick," Lydia whispered. "One at a time, in private, where nobody sees. Money or fear, until the truth just dissolves." She put her hand flat on the table to steady it. "And it'll work, Garrett. That's the terrible thing. It'll work because most of those families are still poor and still scared, and a man from Chicago with a fortune can be very, very persuasive to a widow who's barely holding on. I know. I used to write down the numbers for exactly that kind of persuasion." Mr. Thorne arrived the next week, and he was everything Cora had promised. A smiling, soft-spoken, beautifully dressed man who tipped his hat to every woman and bought drinks for every man and never once raised his voice. He took a room at the hotel. He let it be known he was just here to make sure everyone's rights were respected. And then, one quiet visit at a time, he went to work on the witnesses. Lydia heard about it the way you hear about water seeping into a cellar, slow then all at once. Old Mrs. Bell stopped coming by the office. The Ostranders wouldn't meet her eye in the street. And when she rode out to the Crane place, the widow Crane wouldn't even open the door past a crack. "He said it'd be easier on everyone," Mrs. Crane said through the gap, ashamed not looking at her. "He said the appeal's going to win regardless, that it's all decided back in Chicago anyhow, and if I just sign a paper saying I'm not certain about the dates anymore, there's money in it, money enough to—" Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Miss Cross. I've got grandchildren. I can't fight Chicago. Nobody can fight Chicago." The door closed. Lydia rode back up the mountain in the cold, and she did not cry, because she was past crying, but she walked into Garrett's kitchen and sat down hard and said, "We're losing. He's peeling them off one by one and we're losing, and I don't know how to stop it because he's not doing anything I can read on a deed. He's just buying back the dark." Garrett sat down across from her. "Then we do what we did before," he said. "We make 'em look. It's not the same. At the auction we had surprise. We had the ledger nobody knew we'd recovered. We had a moment. This is slow, Garrett. This is months of a smiling man and a checkbook, and there's no platform to climb up on and no single moment to—" "There's the hearing," Garrett said. "The appeal hearing. That's a moment. The High Court sits in the territorial capital in March. Open court. Anybody can attend." He leaned forward. "Thorne wants the witnesses quiet and scattered and ashamed when that day comes. So we do the opposite. We don't beg 'em one by one in their kitchens where Thorne's already got to 'em. We bring 'em all together. We put 'em on one wagon train, and we ride into that capital as one body in the open in front of the High Court, and Cora Avery's newspaper, and the whole territory, and we let them remember that they're not one scared widow against Chicago. They're 9 families, and a ledger, and a truth that already won once. And if they won't come, if Thorne's frightened them too badly—" Garrett was quiet a moment. "Then we go with whoever'll come," he said. "Even if it's just you and me. Because here's a thing I learned in a closet doorway, Lydia. You don't refuse to look away because you're sure you'll win. You do it because looking away is how the bosses of the world win every single time, and somebody has to be the one who won't. He almost smiled. You taught me that. Up on the pass. Don't you dare unlearn it now. She looked at him for a long, long moment. All right, she said. We make them look. It was not easy. It was the hardest thing she'd done, harder than the closet, harder than the auction, because there was no enemy to point a finger at, just frightened people and a kind man's money. She went back to every family not to argue, but to remind. She brought Tomas Reyes, who'd never wavered, to sit with the ones who had. She read them again, the names from the ledger. And one by one, slow as a thaw, some of them began to remember that they had once stood in the sun and named what was taken from them, and that it had felt like being alive again after years of being buried. But not enough of them. By the eve of the hearing, when the wagons gathered at the foot of Garrett's Mountain in the cold March dark, there were only 5 families willing to ride to the capital. 5 against Chicago. The Cranes had not come. Mrs. Bell had not come. Lydia counted the wagons in the lantern light and felt the old despair rising. It might not be enough, she said. It's enough to start, Garrett said. Climb up. We ride at first light. And then, out of the dark, down the valley road, came the sound of more wheels. A wagon. Then another behind it. Lanterns swinging. Lydia stood up on the wagon seat, her heart in her throat, trying to see, and the first wagon rolled into the lantern light, and on its seat, hunched against the cold, and not meeting anyone's eye, sat the last man in the world she'd expected. Elias Pruitt, the storekeeper. The soft pink man who'd kept her in his closet, because a man's got to live in this town. He stopped his wagon at the edge of the gathered families and sat there a moment in the silence. Every face turned toward him, and then he climbed down stiff and slow and stood twisting his hat in his hands the same way he'd twisted his apron the day Garrett tore the closet door off its latch. I ain't come for forgiveness, Pruitt said to the dirt, to no one, to all of them. I know there ain't any owed me, and I ain't askin'. But that lawyer Thorne, he came to my store last week. Asked me to swear in front of the high court that I never saw the girl hurt. Said I never saw her tied. Said there was money in it. He swallowed. And I almost said yes. God help me, because that's what I always do. I keep my head down, and I keep my store, and I look at my boots. He lifted his head finally, and his eyes found Lydia, and they were wet. But I've been looking at my boots my whole life, Miss Cross. I looked at 'em while you bled in my closet for 2 days. I'm 51 years old, and I have never once in my life done the hard thing, and I am so damn tired of the man I see when I look down. His voice broke completely. I saw what they did to you. I saw the ropes. I saw the blood. I helped them do it. And I'll stand up in that court, and I'll say so in front of everyone, even though it ruins me, because for once in my miserable life, I am going to refuse to look away. The valley was silent, and then Lydia Cross climbed down off the wagon and walked across the cold ground to the man who had nearly let her die. And she did not embrace him, because some things are not so easily mended, but she put out her hand and she said, "Then ride with us, Mr. Pruitt. Ride at the front where they can see you." The story of what Elias Pruitt did spread through the valley that night faster than any rumor Thorne could buy. If the storekeeper, the coward, the man with everything to lose, was willing to stand up in the sun and name what he'd seen, then what excuse was left for anyone? By the time the wagons rolled out at first light, the Cranes had joined them. So had Mrs. Bell. So had families who'd never been part of it at all, who simply could not bear to be the kind of people who stayed home that morning. It was not 5 wagons that rode into the territorial capital 3 days later. It was 31. They came down the capital's main street in a column a quarter-mile long in the open in the daylight, with Cora Avery's pen flying, and the whole town turning out to stare, and they filled the High Court's gallery until there was no room to stand. And when the smiling Chicago lawyer rose to argue that the witnesses were uncertain and misremembering, and that the conviction should be thrown out, he turned to gesture at the empty seats where he'd expected frightened, scattered, absent people to be, and instead he faced a wall of 31 families who had ridden 3 days to be exactly immovably present. His smile faltered. It was the same falter Lydia had seen on Harlan Voss's face at the auction, the small, fatal crack that appears in every man who only ever learned to win in the dark when all at once the lights come up. The appeal failed. The High Court, with the territory watching, and the newspapers printing every word, upheld the conviction, and went further. It ordered an inquiry into the Chicago syndicate itself, the real money, the men who'd never set foot in the valley. Mr. Thorne left the capital on the next train and did not come back. And the method that had outlived Harlan Voss began for the first time to die. It was a long ride home, but it did not feel long. Spring came back to the mountain. The second spring, and the cottonwoods went green again, and the ranch that had been one closed-off man's fortress had become something Garrett could never have imagined the morning he rode into town for nothing more than a rifle. There were families in the bunkhouse, and children in the yard, and a steady traffic of frightened people coming up the valley road with crumpled papers and going back down it standing straighter. Garrett deeded 40 acres of his south pasture, the very pasture they'd once forged a lien against, to be held in trust for families who'd lost everything and had nowhere to begin again. Lydia's records office had grown to 3 rooms and trained 2 young clerks, and the sign in the window had become a thing people pointed out to strangers with pride. And one gold evening, at the end of that second summer, Garrett Hale stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and watched Lydia Cross at the table, the lamp warm on her face, carefully mending a torn old deed, the Crane family's deed, water-stained and creased, the one she'd fought a syndicate in Chicago to make true again, pressing it flat under her steady hands. I watched her a long time, the way he'd watched her that first night when she'd been a stranger and a fugitive who couldn't trust a kind word. And he understood that somewhere across 2 summers and a closet and an auction and a mountain pass in the rain, the way he saw her had changed entirely, and he could not for the life of him say exactly when. He'd carried her up this mountain once, half dead, a woman he'd saved. He didn't see her that way anymore. He hadn't for a long time. She looked up and caught him watching, and she didn't startle or look away the way she once would have. She just smiled, tired and unafraid, and said, "What is it, Garrett?" He crossed the kitchen and pulled out the chair beside her and sat down close, and he took her hand. The hand that had carried a ledger out of the dark, the hand with the faded marks still on the wrist where the ropes had been. "I spent 20 years, he said, thinking the bravest thing a man could do was hold on to what was his, keep his land, keep his head down, trust nobody." He turned her hand over in his. "And then you came bleedin' to a storekeeper's closet carrying the truth. And you taught me the bravest thing isn't holding on at all. It's standing up in the light next to somebody who's afraid and refusing to look away, even when looking away would be easier, even when it costs you everything." "Garrett, I'm not asking you to need saving," he said. "You never did, and I figured that out about you the first week. I'm asking you to stay, to build this with me. The refuge, the office, the families, all of it. Not because either of us can't do it alone, but because I have spent my whole life alone, and I have finally found the one thing on God's earth worth not being alone for, and it's you, Lydia Cross." His voice, the voice that never rose, was steady as stone. "Marry me. Stand in the sun beside me. We'll spend whatever years we've got making sure nobody else has to bleed in the dark to be believed." Lydia Cross, who had once whispered through a torn cloth gag that a rich man would surely hand her back and go home to his supper, looked at the rich man who had done the opposite, who had torn down a door, lost a friend, climbed a mountain, and given away his own land, and she did not whisper now. "Yes," she said, clear and unafraid. "Yes, Garrett, I'll stay." They were married that autumn under the cottonwoods, with Hattie crying into her apron, and Tomas Reyes giving the bride away, and Cora Avery scribbling it all down for a story she said the whole territory would want to read. Elias Pruitt came and stood at the back, and for the first time in years, he held his head up the entire time. Some people had come west looking for gold, and some for land, and some for a clean start, away from whatever they'd been. Lydia Cross had come carrying nothing but the truth, in a battered satchel bleeding for it, certain no one would ever be brave enough to stand beside it. And Garrett Hale, who had ridden into town that summer morning for a rifle, and ridden out with his whole purpose changed, had finally become exactly that man. The dark does not win in a valley where the people refuse to look away. It never did, and it never will. So long as there is one storekeeper willing to lift his head, one clerk willing to carry the truth, and one cowboy brave enough to tear the door off its hinges and stand